The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
That's true. You're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Well, welcome to The Divide. We're sitting here with Kevin, who's the executive director, Kevin Bolling, excuse me, who's the executive director of the Secular Student Alliance. And Kevin, glad to have you.
Pleasure to be here.
And we're asking you the question today. We know that your mission at Secular Student Alliance is in part to promote secular values. So do you consider that sort of your evangelical campaign or mission? Is that sort of how you approach it?
I think that for the organization, what we really see our primary mission is really supporting non-religious students across the United States. And so I think when you look at the developmental years of students and sort of their family background coming into a position where a lot of students are leaving their family background and sort of developing their own values and what's important in their lives, it's a crucial time. And so at that time, and research will show as well, having that support just makes you a much better and productive member of society in figuring out your own values and then how you go and live those out in your life.
So the question to me was meant to be, about whether or not you do this as an outreach, sort of to make the world more secular, and so I'm curious if that sort of factors into your response. If there's anything else you could say about that.
Campus crusade for atheists. Is that what you mean? Is that what you mean?
For secularists.
For secularists, right? And it's I think I think the reality in the United States is that the U.S. is becoming more and more secular. And if you look at not that long ago, 1 in 5 of the U.S. population identified as non-religious. Now the general in the United States is 1 in 4. If you look at students, a couple years ago, it was 1 in 3. And Ryan Burge just had his new data out from last year where it's 47% of college-age students below are non-religious. So do I think it's going in that direction? And quickly, and especially because of some of the things that's happening in religion and in politics? Definitely. Do I think that we are out there actively recruiting and mission-based, evangelical pushing? No, I don't. We look at the students who are involved with us. It's what they want to do on their campus. It's their passion, their mission, their activism, and we help promote and support that. The other aspect of that is especially students in highly religious areas, highly rural, in the Deep South and the Midwest. We know that there is increased levels of prejudice and stigma and concealment and discrimination and harassment because of their non-religious beliefs, especially over those who have religious beliefs. So are we there to help them find friends and community? And for the student who goes, I thought I was the only one who thought this way, and we're like, oh no, there's so many of you. So getting them that connected, and we're like, okay, part of I always say is like, okay, great, you don't believe in a God. That tells me so little about you. Now tell me what you're passionate about. Now tell me about how your values are going to make the world a better place. It's going to make the world a better place for others, make the world a better place for you. Now tell me about that. And what are you going to go and do? So the last part of our mission is activism. And we don't say secular activism, although, of course, we like that. But it's whatever you're passionate about and whatever you want to change to make the world a better place. And we know from our students, there's lots of different areas, whether it's climate change and environmentalism, or it's LGBT rights, or women's rights, or racial justice, or promoting science in, whether it's, and again, climate change, government policy, all those sorts of things. So whatever they're passionate about, run with it. That's what we want them to do.
Am I right that if they said they were really passionate about supporting a Trump campaign for 2024, that would be the enthusiasm would wane a little bit of support?
It doesn't for us.
Okay.
We use the term secular as a umbrella inclusive term, because we know students coming in, and I mean, and again, our target is youth, so developmentally they're at a different place than adults. So we know that they come in using lots of different terms to describe themselves. We also know, just as many other cultures and subpopulations in the United States, students are using less and less specific identification terms. So that's also happening with non-religious students. So they may identify in, we did an internal survey, and rather than atheist or humanist or free thought, really the most popular one was 4 or 5 different ways to identify themselves. So we know that that exists. The other thing is, we also know, and while statistically, most non-religious people probably lean heavy Democrat, and there's lots of statistics to support that. And just within the national 2 parties, what they'll report back, that shows as well. We have students from a variety of political backgrounds, when that's just not Republican and Democrat, that's Libertarian, and we'll just keep on going with that as far as background. So we make sure that what we are producing and what we're doing is what the students want to do. So whatever that is, and a lot of the things that we do produce that politics is actually, what are your values? Now look at the people who are running. How do those match up? So you do get to determine who's your closest, the politician who thinks like you, and then now what are you gonna do about that?
So there's a very real way in which it's not just, set up to help students, I guess, with a basket of values that you have already set up, but to help them live out whatever values they bring to the table.
Definitely so. And
so I guess what makes,
depending where they'll have different things that are important to them, and what they need to what they need to take care of first.
That's what I'm getting. Okay, so this is what, and sometimes I'll play like Bill's role on this, but what comes to mind immediately is like, so why the Secular Student Alliance? And that may not even be Bill's question, so I'm not trying to put that word in his mouth, but it is interesting to me, because it's like, what part of, is it just because religion can be damaging, to some people in some situations, or is there something more innate about making it secular?
And I think there's 2 parts there. One, I think, is the primary focus, and the students who are drawn to us. There is an overwhelming self-identifier that somewhere with them identifies as non-religious, and whatever words you want to, atheist, agnostic, non-believer. So that's clearly a draw for our students. If they were a student who didn't, who's a non-believing student, but their main identifier was environmental, justice, they're going to go and get involved with an environmental organization. Or LGBT rights, if their main identifier is, that's where they're going to go. So there is something where this is an elevated issue, concern, passion, whatever you want to call it, for the students, that they're attracted to us. So there is an underlier, yes, non-religion, separation of church and state. With that comes a lot of other values. I mean, we all have values. So, and religious people like to claim that they're the proprietor of values, and they come from whatever book happens to be. But the reality is we all have society has its values. We all have our own values, and that has nothing to, that's a societal thing and an internal drive that creates both of those. So,
Are there ever times when students, a student or a group of students wants to work on or promote a value that you're not entirely okay with? Has that ever happened? I'm just curious.
There has happened. So we, as part of working with the Secular Student Alliance, we value inclusion, and I think there's been a couple instances, and in my 4 years, I think it's happened twice. We've had some students who didn't want to be inclusive of other students. And we've had to say, I'm sorry, that is one of our primary core values. And so that's not something that we can do. If you want to have a conversation on, a racial issue, and you want people from a bunch of different sides to be able to talk on that, great, let's have that conversation. But when you're just out to discriminate against somebody, then that's not something that we will stand by. And oftentimes then that's, oftentimes the student will elect to leave the organization, and that's quite all right.
Let me ask you a question, Kevin. I think one of the things that really frustrates the younger generation is that everything's bifurcated. So everything's pushed to an extreme in the conversation. You're either right or left. And I sense a weariness to in the sort of collegiate world, that everything, like you said, you talked about the identifiers, that some people are sort of eschewing identifiers, and I think that's part of it. So how do you sort of make people feel like you truly could be pro-life and welcome in the SSA? Because I'm guessing at least my experience of the couple of conventions I went to, I'm guessing there wouldn't have been a large group of people that were pro-life in that context. And I'm saying that is in something where I think what you're trying to articulate is you would want someone like that to feel completely welcome in your group. Isn't that correct?
I would say we do have students who are pro-life. Is that, and I think as you made the point, no, that is not the majority of our students. And so we know that it's somewhere like 85-90% of our students believe in the women's right to choose. And there's, when you deconstruct that a little bit, our students also know sort of the biblical things of what the Bible says about women, and the Bible is not great towards women at all. Just in its messaging. So they also know the moral majority, that they know, and the part of making abortion a political issue to benefit Republicans and religion. They also understand that, and going, it really wasn't an issue for a long time until it became a wedge issue against women, and also primarily then used against LGBT people.
All right. Because one of the things, I remember doing an interview with a couple of people at one of the conventions, and I was asking them, does SSA stand primarily for separation of church and state, or primarily for sort of a set of secular values? And I got completely different answers from different people. No surprise, right? So some thought there was just way too much focus on almost like a new set of 10 commandments. And if you sort of don't put your toes on the line, then that's not really welcomed. And then others were like, we really like the fact they're promoting values, secular values, progressive values in the end. So they had different, they were clearly not quite on the same page. I have no idea what the statistics would be on that. It just was an issue that I remember popping up. So what's your response to that?
What I would say, one, I think you have to look at students developmentally. So typically when students are coming into college, they're very dualistic. So it's right or wrong, yes or no, separation of church and state. So they're probably also just leaving their parents and coming into this realization of non-religion, and that's how they're identifying. And so oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes you will see a bit of animus towards religion as a bit of a default. So I think we hope a little bit that as they stay with us, and just their development in general, you move to a much more pluralistic thought process where there's shades of gray and other, you also have time as a student to sort of percolate and go, okay, if what I learned as, what values I learned growing up, what do I really want to keep, and what I don't believe in? And so you need some time to make that adjustment. So where you hit students in those 4 years of typical college, there's a lot of that happens. So I would see that as sort of a natural progression. So I often think, we have students who start as atheists and leave us as humanists, just because they have time for those values to sort of set in. They have time to figure it out for themselves. They have time to talk with other people about it. That's the conversations that happen in some of our chapters is one of the things that I just think is the most fantastic. And I think last time we had talked about, there's a number of religious students who are members of our organization, because one of the few places they can have conversations about religion, just except for we have to talk about it this way in these 5 points, where they get to doubt, where they get to play with it, where they get to challenge the doctrine or vehemently support it. And our students tend to be very smart about lots of religions and religious doctrine. They're coming there to have those conversations because there's nowhere else where they can have them or where it's safe to have them. So I love that we're that option as well.
Is there an implied sense then for you that it's a victory if someone comes as just an atheist and ends a humanist? Like you view that as maturing in the right direction, so to speak?
I think it depends. My goal for the student to be well-adjusted and happy and feel supported and go on to make a difference in their life. So if they want to be the firebrand atheist who, and that is their passion, go for it. So developmentally, and I come from a student affairs development background, and so learning, student development theory. Would I hope that someone went through that process and developed further and a holistic human being? Of course I do. So, but we're going to support the students wherever they are, and part of it, even in that firebrand atheists, I think that everyone sort of knows about, there's definite values that people have, and hopefully they're doing the best then to go on and change the world the best they can.
It's interesting how much of your experience to me, like, first of all, let me tell you how a lot of Christians will hear this interview. They'll think, wow, there's this whole the equivalent of a Christian ministry in the secular atheist world on campuses all around the country. First of all, wow, surprise. And secondly, they'll think maybe they'd think this, you probably have a very similar experience to the way a lot of campus, people who run campus ministries have, of the sort of people come in, they're young, they make a lot of the mistakes that youth do, but in the particular area that you are promoting or overseeing or whatever. And so there's a lot of sort of trying to help them become mature human beings, period. Right. Yeah. So I would think there would be a lot of shared experience. Go ahead.
Well, I think one thing that I appreciate about religion and religious communities is that sense of community. So where you go and that you have, I'm going to cheapen it a little bit, but the guaranteed support and friendship and those sorts of things. So do we want any student to feel that? Of course. So wherever they find that sense of belonging and sense of growth and sense of community, would I support that? As long as it's not negative, yes, of course I would. So yeah.
Do you feel like then that, sorry to tyrannize, Drew, you can take the next question, but do you feel like then that, because you sound like people who might be religious, if they're, I guess you might say, doing it the right way, you feel more warm to the idea of some people being religious, or in other words, like if do you feel like the big problem for Christianity is just that it's irredeemable, or that, well, if people actually did follow the teachings of Jesus, that wouldn't be so bad?
I personally don't. For religious people, me personally, I'm like, great, go on, have your religion. If it's something you personally are practicing and it affects you, I have no issue with that whatsoever. It's when you would start to impose your religious values on other people, and especially when you step on my rights to not, that's where I'm going to take some issue with you. Am I going to do that in a respectful way? Yes. So I think we try to do that for our students. Would I compare what we do to religion? No. One, because there's not a book, there's not a Bible, there's not that setup, and intentionally so, because we're gonna believe and set those values on different things. So, and I think when you look at the values of Jesus, if you look at the followers, there's a lot of values that are espoused by Jesus's followers that I do not think are good values at all, and I would not want our students pursuing. And I think a lot of organized religion, especially Christianity in the United States, why it's seeing so many youth leaving it, is in part very much because of that.
Can you name one of those?
Inclusion.
Okay.
Hypocrisy. Anti-science.
So you're talking not just about the Bible per se, but the way that followers of the Christian religion are act in the modern world.
Yes, and I think, and oftentimes leaders of religion who you see, but also yes, religious followers as well. And I mean, and I think to this question that one just before, there's this assumption again that religious values are good values, and you can't have values without religion. So I don't believe all religious values are good, and I definitely believe you can have values never having known about religion ever, and you can have lots of good values.
Let me interrupt and say I agree with both those points, by the way.
Okay,
I agree with both your answers. Yeah.
You know, that's what's kind of jumping out at me, Bill, is that I kind of expected us to have a three-way divide. We sometimes call it a trivide. When you know, thinking that Kevin was going to say, well, I think there does need to be some, use the word evangelization or don't, but there needs to be some promoting of the secular. But it's not really the secular, I feel like, that he's trying to promote. It's not really the religious that he's trying to avoid. It's the dogmatic. It's the things that I would agree, and maybe to some extent even you, Bill, would agree, can be negative about religion. My other thought with this, you know, other than why secular, is why not religious, and I think we've kind of gotten to that too. So I'm actually struggling for another direction to take this. It is interesting to think about how much we do agree on, and that's something I've been thinking about in a lot of our recent episodes. We all want young people to have a community that they can thrive in. All three of us want that. All three of us want people to feel to be able to act out their values. I guess the values that we believe are the most important ones may somehow differ.
Yeah, well, we're also Americans, so we like the idea that people get to do what they want in their homes on their private property. That's just something that sort of goes through.
It is almost
Christian
like
or non-religious. Yeah,
it does sound just almost over patriotic, jingoistic, or something to say that freedom is a core value for all of us. But I think it's also a truism. I mean, I definitely think that's one thing that even those following or trying to follow a religion would say freedom of religion. That's one of the core things that they would value. So there certainly are differences that we could hit on when it comes to values. I'm interested if we want to go that direction or just.
Well, I was going to ask him a quick question, Kevin, if you could, because Christians hearing this are going to say, well, Kevin sounds energized, sounds excited. I think probably the term is hopeful, like in a sense of things are sort of turning, the tide's turning a little more in the direction you would hope it would go. And the statistics, if you want to say it that way, are moving in your direction. And of course, on the Christian side is going to be saying, yes, this is exactly what the Christian is afraid of, that the tide is turning in the opposite direction. And it's but they're one of their responses is going to be, well, what's values across history, right? We can talk in platitudes, but I mean, ultimately people get into power, they pass laws, and they have massive influence on what's going on in the culture, what's allowed, what isn't allowed. So what is this brave new secular world like? What is it founded upon? That's what's going to be the thing that holds people together, and then how are people going to be treated who don't fall in line with that?
Well, I think if you look at there's a lot. How do I say this? In looking at values that a lot of non-religious people, and especially young people, that they find important to them. So you're looking at LGBT rights and women's right to choose and environmental issues. It really is about inclusion and a little bit of freedom with that. But I think there's also, I would think when we just say freedom, we forget that we're in a larger community and our actions affect other people. And so there is a social responsibility that we all have as well. So while yes, we have our freedom, you also have to incorporate the social responsibility in this. So I think we want to end suffering. We want to make this world more inclusive. We want people to be better. So I think those are some core general things. I don't think that the secular community, we in general have this sort of prime directive of this is what you have to believe and this is the way you have to do it. Religion is much more on that toe of this is, your yay or nay, and tend to be much less accepting of people who don't agree with the prescribed doctrine. So where I think the atheist community is much more freer in that, much more open in that, and letting people sort of figure that out. So, and I think a little bit to your point a little bit before is, part of we say is we're looking for a more secular future. And so part of that is separation of church and state, freedom of and from religion, and knowing that we continue to go. We want science to be leading and making our decisions, not a book that was written a long time ago that has no relationship to the world today and how we live it in technology and society and the environment and those sorts of things. So there's multiple aspects of that we should be looking at science and those sorts of things and sort of directing how we decide on how we're going to live.
Yeah, it would seem like most of the values should correspond. Most of our values, even in terms of just sort of forget the sort of dogma from on high sort of thing. I just mean the basic golden rule principle: do to others as Jesus taught, that you would want them to treat them the way you would want them to treat you. That's going to involve a lot of things that are going to be similar. Yeah.
I like a lot of religious people like to designate the golden rule to Jesus, and I'm not quite sure that it was. So there's the golden rule and the platinum rule, and I don't think either one of those were Jesus. But.
Well, no need to argue about it, but because I don't want to get into the history of it, but okay. I do think it's rightly attributed to him, but it's fine. All my point is that whether he said it initially or not, it's the kind of thing that the vast majority of humanity is going to say, now that's a good idea. Most people are going to say that is a good way to try and live your life in a society. And if you're going to have an enjoyable society, you're going to have to ultimately live along something like that. So it means there's going to be a lot of things that correspond. I know in the political world, everything's is a talking point, and there's all this stuff about, but people get really passionate about very, very nuanced, narrow things about which the Bible, say, from a Christian perspective, says virtually nothing other than in very broad underlying principles. If you take, for example, I've been asked probably 15 times in the last 2 weeks about Ravi Zacharias. Okay, so this an epic moral, not just collapse, but a scandal of epic proportions that's come out about how he manipulated, abused women, people that were through even using money and so on, and on money of the ministry and things like this. And when I hear Christians talk about that, they're not just disappointed, they're disgusted and aghast at the fact that he would treat the lives of these people so cheaply, because they think because as I've been told now multiple times, isn't that supposed to be the central part of the message of the cross of Jesus, that each individual has been made in God's image and is therefore of eternal value? How did this guy, how was he so dualistic in his mind and his spirit? How did a whole organization how did this even happen in a place that supposedly had a good reputation and so on? So how is like the Secular Student Alliance going to react if a similar type scandal were to happen? Is it like what animates the moral fabric of responding to it? You know what I mean by that?
A similar situation.
Or a similar thing, yeah.
In the religious community,
a Weinstein type thing not in a secular organization. Has that happened yet?
It has, yes. And I think the vast majority of the secular movement has denounced it, has come together and tried to do things internally to make sure that doesn't happen again. What if it's in an organized sort of event? People aren't giving speaking platform. I didn't want to say shunned. I feel like that's such a religious word. But really, I mean, once you do something like that, people don't want to deal with you. So in those sort of moral and ethical spheres. So I think the community has been, most of the community has been quick to not stand for any of that and expect better. And just organizationally, I know there's lots of things going on, whether it's training or expectations being set at conferences and events and those sorts of things that help ensure that that doesn't happen.
So I'm certainly I'm obviously not surprised that that's how you'd react or respond, and I think it's good. But what I was trying to show what was a divide. I was looking for a divide between us all, and of course you've said a number of other things I haven't responded to, but that's typical for all of us in these kind of conversations. But what I was trying to show was how the so-called dogma, which is so supposedly bad in our conversation, that in that case I was trying to show how the message of the cross of Christ, the central part of the good news surrounding Jesus' ministry and so on, that event and the significance of it is a dogma which is shaping the very core value of how all these Christians are responding to what this Ravi Zacharias did. So I was showing how that informs their moral impulse and so on. So what is it? In other words, I know you
see.
Would respond.
I think I would disagree there, though, Bill, because yes, I do think that sort of the idea that God has created us, with, what's the quote from the Declaration of Independence? Has endowed us with,
inalienable rights.
Inalienable rights, but also just like personhood. This biblical idea of like there's this. There's a word that's just not coming to mind, but this sanctity, I guess, of life, that is sort of something that you can point to for it. Is, well, God created us, there is a sanctity to life. I would say that even if you don't believe that is the case, you can still believe in sort of a sanctity of life. And just as we would all, I think, agree with the golden rule and the platinum rule, I think, we would all agree that there is some sense in which we want humans to thrive and not to be trod upon. So I don't know that, I guess if you're asking what you've asked me before, and why do you believe that, or what is your what do you base that on? I think I would just say that that's something that humans have figured out as they have figured out the golden rule, that is a way to live in a healthy way and a happy way, and a way not to suffer, do the opposite and suffer it at our own hands. I don't know if that. I'll kick it to Kevin now. I want to hear his opinion on this, but I just sort of bristle a little bit at the idea that that's a Christian idea.
Right. And I'm glad that instance they chose to stand against that. If you look at the Catholic Church and the unbridled abuse that happened for years and years in the cover-up and those things, when the most stories that I came out after that of believers was that, well, that wasn't the church, that was just some people, and that the church is a bunch of people, it's not just the organization. So two justifications of how that wasn't us, and I think the largest one was like, oh no, that was just the gay priests, and I'm like, no, this was a system, so that doesn't really, I mean, there was way more excuses and that came out of that. When you look at the Boy Scouts, and the Boy Scouts is a different but religious based organization, same sort of thing, huge scandal and people jumping towards it, not away from it, and making excuses for it, not holding people accountable. So I think those are very sort of different things. And then when you look more societally, when you look at really a lot of religious, people who claim to be preachers and ministers and those things, their language towards women is super misogynistic. It is not uplifting. It is not equal based. When you look at the religious dogma, and language and open things against LGBT people. I mean, you have Christian preachers saying we should kill gay people. So, and I don't hear a big collective from the rest of the world, no, you don't, that's not what we believe. They're like, well, you know, so, or we should deny people rights just because of that. So, you know, all this, look at a lot of the science denial, the anti-vaxxers, those sorts of things that are happening now. The roots of most of that, not all, comes from the religious community. So there's also, I think, a hypocrisy of in the United States of Christianity, because if we had, you know, there's the push right now, you know, in God we school posted in schools, which clearly violates separation of church and state in public schools. If that was in Allah, we believe, or pick, you know, in Buddha, religious community would be up in arms. But are you not supporting religion? You know, it's your religion that you care about, and screw everyone else. I'm being super dogmatic there. So, but I mean, that really is, there's a heart of that that's very true. And I think when you have, even I think Liz Cheney said yesterday, was we have to be careful that the Republican Party and the evangelical movement aren't seen as the party of white supremacy, because the last 4 years, those are so, Christian nationalism and white supremacy are so linked at every level, where multiple, I mean, Fox News has said, you know, when someone makes a claim against white supremacism, Fox News is going, hey, they're coming at you, Christians, because it's that linked now in today's verbiage. So I wish I could be on board with you talking about how good it is and how much it's standing up for equality and inclusiveness. And again, I think that's why a lot of people, young people, are leaving religion.
I think that part is right. And for me, it's more just a lot of examples of, we can't get into all the details, but of a number of things where people are just simply living in complete disregard to what Jesus actually said, what he taught, what he did, and what its significance was. That doesn't account quite for everything you mentioned, but I think that accounts for a lot of it. I think one divide that I see that's forming, which is not a surprise, is that a lot of what's happened in America, which has been predominantly Christian, but it's just predominantly human, is just, for me, it's just predominantly human. And that means humans being fallen creatures, as I think Genesis is right about this, that it's not a surprise to me that in the end, there's massive moral failure, not just in religious groups historically, because of course Christianity is kind of late to the table historically, but across humanity, across history. I mean, it's just a sea of carnage of what humans are prepared to do to one another. And I'm not optimistic and energized about the future, but I also am not pessimistic to the point where life doesn't matter either. But my Christianity this is another place where sort of a dogma is informing my judgment, that, you know, I think there's going to be a lot of disappointment in the future for things that people are optimistic about today. So I kind of sense maybe you guys maybe are a little more optimistic that we might be turning a tide in history, and I'm a little bit more skeptical when I look out. And I'm the skeptic in this respect when we look out more long term.
Well, I would say that I don't necessarily believe that secularism is going to save us by any means, or that any secular idea is good. And I don't think Kevin would either. Even it said earlier, I believe that there have been students with ideas he didn't want to get behind and help them with, you know. So there are bad ideas in the world, but and maybe I'm not even fair to dogmatism. Maybe that's not the core issue, but I think we, even your example, Bill, we all agree that there have been damages done in the name of religion and
in the name of non-religion. It's just a human problem. Was it William Golding, the writer of Lord of the Flies, who was an atheist, by the way, said the problems of human government are the problems of human nature.
And maybe and I feel like that's one important thing that I'm happy to hear Kevin say, that important reason not to evangelize about, or whatever word you want to use, about secularism or about anti-religion. It's like, that's not the point. That's not the thing that I want to stress and that I want to see society uphold as a banner. I mean, again, freedom is a little trite to use as a word, but I want to see people not held back by these things, and so that's kind of where I come down. So I'm a little skeptical that the old ways were better.
Kevin, you want to get the final word? I think we could easily really keep going because we have so many things that have just opened up in the last 10 minutes. But Kevin, you want to get the final word?
I would just say I am hopeful about the future, and I think clearly looking at the United States right now, I think it's a little bit depressing no matter where you are in whatever spectrum, political, social. It's not a feel good. But when I get to work with youth, and I primarily work with secular youth, but what they are passionate about, what they're doing on their campuses, when I get to read scholarship applications, and we do secular activists, so you're doing something, it doesn't have to be separation of church and state or non-religion, whatever you're activist about. I am floored by the changes that they are making in their communities, the ending suffering, helping other people. So I think that's what I'm super hopeful about. And I do think that there needs to be enough commonality between us and understanding. And I think that youth are tired of what they are seeing in our current society by adults, quote unquote. So I'm doing air quotes for that one. So I really look forward that their world and their leadership is going to look very different than what we currently have. And it's, I think, a much more pluralistic, much more accepting, a much more forward-thinking world, because they're the ones having to deal with, am I going to have a planet here soon that's capable of sustaining me? So their world is going to look very different. And I'm excited to see what they are doing now and what they're going to be doing in the future.
One thing's for sure, we'll continue to be a pluralistic society as we've been now for a long time. So, well, thanks very much, Kevin. Really enjoyed the conversation. Wish we could go a little longer, but I think we've reached an end. And I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.